our mics unless we're speaking.
Yeah, let's do that. I think everyone's muted except for you. So let's do that. Let me pull up our notes here. All right. Hopefully everyone can see the notes. Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, good. All right, we're going to begin. Just to remind ourselves, last week we talked about those first 3 steps when we're studying a book. Focus on the book itself, read and observe, background context, literary context, and then discussed, of course, the book of Psalms. Doesn't really fit the same category as any other book in the Bible because it's a collection of independent poems, each with its own occasion, each with its own background and setting, each with its own context and purpose. And so with the Psalms, that's the only book that we don't do the first 3 steps for. It's the only book in the Bible, all right? So with the Psalms, we dive right into the 4th step, which is the poetic analysis, which I've highlighted here. And for poetic analysis, let me note for you, these are the 5 steps that we will cover for poetic analysis. And in these steps, the first step is to take the poem and read through it several times, make observations. The second step, which we began last week, is then to identify the setting. That's the background of the poem and also its structure. How is it divided up? What is its outline? The stanzas, identifying those stanzas, and we'll do that this morning. The third step is looking at the parallelism. And then the 4th step is identifying the imagery, the poetic devices used. And then lastly, the 5th step is then to take all of that information and summarize the theme of the poem and summarize each stanza in the poem based on the current understanding after those 4 steps are completed. So as I mentioned, we started looking at the setting last week of the poem. And to do that, the setting is basically the background context. That is, what is the occasion of the poem? And the background context of a poem is similar to the things that we look for in the background context of a book. So for example, we want to identify who is the author of this poem? Who are the recipients? When was this poem written? Any geography mentioned within the poem? Any places that are mentioned there? Any people that we find in the poem besides the author? Any people that are mentioned? And then finally, what appears to be the occasion for the poem? So again, occasion is what prompted it, just like in the epistles, right? The epistles are what are called occasional writings, meaning there was some set of circumstances that caused the author to write the epistle. Well, we can look at poetry in the same way, that there's some particular occasion, series of events, something that happened that prompted the author to write. And in the Psalms, he wrote in the form of a poem. Okay, now we know in Hebrew poetry, or in the Psalms in particular, who is the most prominent author of the Psalms? Pastor Jason, who's the most prominent author, the most common author in the Psalms?
David.
David is, right? That was an easy one. All right. Who can tell me a few more authors? Brother Harris, how about you? Can you name a couple of other authors of the Psalms in the Psalms?
Good morning, everyone. Asaph, Moses, sons of Korah, Solomon.
Oh, very good. Yeah. We have a Hebrew poetry scholar among us. Yes, those are several of the other authors that are mentioned in the Psalms. Now, David wrote about half or just over half of the Psalms. Asaph wrote, I think, 12, 13, or 14, as did the sons of Korah. Those are the second most common authors. Solomon wrote 2 or 3. Moses wrote 1 psalm. And then there are what are called the orphan psalms. There's about 30-something, 34 psalms, I think, that don't have a stated author. They don't have any information regarding who wrote it. So they're called orphans. But of course, they had an author, but we don't know exactly who it is in those cases. So anyway, for background context, what we're trying to do is then look at the poem and see if we can identify these categories mentioned here to understand the background of the poem. Now, why is it helpful or important to do this? Why do we need to, or why should we look at the background of a poem? What does that help us in understanding the poem? Does anyone want to respond to that? Pastor Entz, what do you think?
It allows us to properly analyze why the author said what he said, and probably we can lift some even application later on.
Okay. Okay, good. Anyone want to add anything to that as far as why it is helpful to look into the background of these psalms that you're studying?
The authorial intent, Pastor.
Okay, what about the authorial intent?
He wanted to know what the original meaning or the intention of the author to his audience, the original audience.
Yeah, and so the more we can understand about who he is and what his background is and what the situation is, that will help us better understand what he's trying to say. Just like in an epistle, right? I mean, that was the reason we studied the background in an epistle, was to try to enter into the world of the author as best as we can. And that's the same for Hebrew poetry, the same for the Psalms. We try to enter into the world of the author at the time that he wrote the psalm. And so, again, remember, too, as we examine each of these steps, especially author and recipients, it's not just naming who the author is, but what is the author's tone? What's his situation? What does he say about himself? What does he say about the recipients? So it's that kind of information as well. So last week, we talked about one place sometimes that is given within the psalm that helps us, gives us specific details about the background. What was that item we talked about last week that is found in some of the psalms? You guys remember?
The title.
Yeah, the title, or the superscription.
The superscript.
Some people call it. I'll just type it in here. The title or the superscription. Okay? And Brother Harris, can you tell us what is when we say title of the psalm or superscription of the psalm, what are we talking about? Where do we find that? What is it?
It tells us about the background of a particular psalm, Pastor Tim. Like, for example, when for Psalm 51, when after Nathan confronted David because of his sin, so it gives us the background context of a particular psalm.
Yes.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
And most of the time it points us to the passage in the for example in Samuel, where we can read the story for us to give us the particular historical background of the particular psalm.
Okay, exactly. Psalm 51 and 52 are perfect examples of that. Often the title, we get the author. Sometimes we'll get the circumstance behind the psalm. Sometimes we will get the purpose of the psalm, like we looked at in Psalm 100. Sometimes we will get some musical instruction in the psalm. It'll talk about certain instruments or a certain tone that the psalm is to be sung by. Sometimes we will get instruction about what was I thinking? The purpose, the musical instruction. There was one more thing, and it's escaped my mind right now. And so some of that background will come from the psalm title, but not every psalm has a title. In fact, as I mentioned, there are several orphan psalms that have no information at all as far as a title or superscription. But by studying the psalm itself, we can still determine answers to most of these issues, or most of these background setting, background context issues. All right. So that's what we're going to have to do for Psalm 99, because Psalm 99 has no title. It has no superscription. It just immediately begins with the psalm. So what I want to have us do is we'll read through the psalm together. I'll pick 3 of you to read 3 verses each. And as we're reading, take note of these background topics, these background items: author, recipients, when written, geography, people mentioned, occasion. And we'll talk about that after we read through the psalm together. So let's go ahead and do that. Psalm 99. And I'm going to ask Brother Manny if you can read verses 1 through 3. And then, let's see, Pastor Renee, if you can read verses 4 to 6. And then Pastor Tabs, if you could read verses 7 through 9. All right? So we'll start with you, Manny.
Verses 1 to 3. The Lord reigns. Let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim. Let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted above all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he.
The strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. He is holy. Moses, Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them.
He spoke to them in the pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave them. Our Lord, O Lord our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, and yet an avenger of their evil deeds. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God.
Very good. All right, so as we read this psalm together, let's consider the background context. First, the author. Is the author mentioned, or do we have any indication of who the author is? Anybody pick that up? By your silence, I will assume that means we don't know. The author is unknown, okay? Possibly David, and we'll talk about that later, but we don't know. It's not stated. Now, what would you say, though, is the tone of the author? Do we know anything about the author, just as far as how the tone of this psalm? What would you say about that?
It was a tone of exaltation,
Okay.
celebration,
Of what? Sorry, exaltation and what?
celebration.
Celebration. And where do you see that?
Through words like exalt the Lord. The Lord is great. He's exalted. The repetition of the word exalt, exalted.
Yeah, those first couple of verses,
Words
right?
Like
Yeah, good. Those first couple of verses, he really comes out with a strong tone of the greatness of God, right? And exaltation of the Lord. And then even in verse 5 and verse 9, he says, exalt the Lord, worship him. So we definitely see a tone here of excitement in exalting the Lord. Okay? All right, how about the recipients? What would you guys say as far as the recipients? Who appears to be the recipients of this poem? Any ideas?
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
preferably Israelites who are worshippers, because there is a call for them to worship.
Okay, good. Where do we see that?
You could see that in verse 5, worship at his footstool. Verse 9, worship at his holy hill.
Okay, very good. And I think we know too that he's referring to Israelites based on who he mentions in verse 6, right? He mentions Moses and Aaron and Samuel, right? People in Israel's history. So the people of Israel, specifically those who are coming to the temple, those being summoned to the temple for worship. All right, and I mentioned temple, and I'll explain why in a minute. Unless, can you guys see any references here that might indicate that he's speaking to people who are he's wanting to focus them on worship at the temple? You guys see any indications in the psalm there?
Yeah, Holy Hill, the mention of the word holy, words Holy Hill.
Okay, good. Holy Hill in verse 9. And then also notice in verse 2, where is the Lord great?
Zion.
Zion. And Zion again, we'll talk about that when we get to geography. All right. There's one other reference. It may not be obvious what that's referring to right now. Verse 5, he says footstool. Okay. And a study of other passages where this word is used, it's either used in reference to the earth, like Isaiah 66, or to the temple. Temple is called, and I think it's in Chronicles, I don't remember the exact passage yet, that the temple's referred to as his footstool. All right. We'll talk more about that later. All right. When was it written? And again, we're not given a date here in the psalm, but can we determine a time period, a range of time? When was the earliest it could have been written? I'll start there.
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
it's definitely post Samuel, after the death of Samuel, perhaps.
And why would you say that?
Because of verse 6, it is said Samuel also was among those calling on his name. So
Okay.
in past tense.
All right, good. What else indicates that it would be after the time of Samuel at the earliest? When was there a Zion? When was there a Jerusalem? When was there a Temple Mount? Was it before the days of Samuel?
After Samuel.
It was after.
Yeah.
How do we know that? When was Jerusalem established? Was it established when Joshua came into the land and they defeated all of the cities? Is that when Jerusalem was also?
No, it was
No.
established during the
David.
time of David, as he was rising to be the king in the earlier days of David.
Exactly. There was no Zion before David, as far as Zion in the sense of the central location of Israel, right? There was no Temple Mount until David conquered the Jebusites who were in Jerusalem. Remember that? So since we're talking here about his holy hill, about the temple mount, we know that this could not have been before David, right? David takes Jerusalem, and then remember, he establishes the tabernacle there, and then remember, he brings the ark into that tabernacle. Now, is there any mention here that might hint at the ark? you see anything in this psalm that might be a reference to the ark?
Pastor Tim, verse 7, in the pillar of the cloud, he spoke to them.
Okay, verse 7, he mentions the pillar of the cloud. Now, was that, what does that remind us of?
It's the presence of God.
When and where?
In the tabernacle.
Okay, the tabernacle located where? You guys didn't know we'd be talking Israel's history here, did you, today?
Yeah. During the wilderness.
Yeah, tabernacle in the wilderness, right? Or the tent of meeting, it was called at times. Remember that?
Yeah.
So this would have been in the days of Moses. So so we know, since we're talking here about the time period of at least David or later, the pillar of cloud there, I think, would be a reference to an earlier time. There's another phrase here in this psalm that seems to indicate or point to the presence of the ark.
He dwells between the cherubim, Pastor Tim.
Yeah, the cherubim. Now, where is it that we see God? In the NAS, it says enthroned above the cherubim. Where do we see the cherubim? God and the cherubim together.
The Holy of Holies.
Yeah, on the Ark of the Covenant. What's at the top? What's on the top of the ark?
2 angels.
Cherubim.
The cherubim, right? Remember? And they have their wings spread, touching each other on top of the ark, and the mercy seat is there. The mercy seat located above the cherubim on the top of the ark. I think verse 2, which is where this is, verse 2 seems to be a reference to that. He's enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. All right? Can't be certain. This will be something we could follow up with later, but I think it's likely a reference to the ark here. And
that's verse 1, Pastor Tim, right? Cherubim. Not
cherubim.
verse 2?
Oh, I'm sorry. Verse 1. Thank you. Verse 1. Now, if that is the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, what would that tell us about when is the latest this psalm could have been written?
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
David.
Before 586, before the destruction of the temple.
Before the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians.
Yes.
The final destruction was 586, right? That's when they took out all of the temple
articles,
contents of the temple, right? So yeah, 586 would be the latest. And in fact, though, if you can remember, the last reference to the ark is actually in the days of Josiah. In 2 Chronicles 36, I think 18 and 19, the ark is mentioned. That's the last reference to the ark in the Old Testament. Josiah was around 640 to, I think it's 609, somewhere in there, all right? So it's likely the ark was still there the few years after his reign, but then we know for sure when the Babylonians came, they took out everything out of the temple and they destroyed the temple. So if verse 1 is actually a reference to the ark, then we have a window here of when this psalm was written. The earliest it could have been written is in the days of David.
Yeah.
In the days when David was king, right? Because that's when he brought the ark into the tabernacle. The latest would be just before the Babylonian exile. Okay? So So this would be somewhere around 1000 BC. This would be somewhere around 600 BC. All right. Now, when it was in that time frame, anyone have any thoughts or ideas? If we had to make a guess, what would you say it would? Was it be more likely closer to the days of David, closer to the days of the Babylonian exile, or somewhere between? What do you guys think? No one wants to guess? Everyone's afraid.
It's more in the. I think this was written more during David's time, because it's so similar to several other psalms that have basically the same thought and the same words. So most likely it was written during David's time.
Do you have any psalms that come to your mind in particular, Pastor Robbie?
I think Psalm 96.
Yeah. Psalm 96, 98. In fact, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, this is a great observation. I would tend to agree with you, because if you read through the Psalm 96, 97, 98, even 93, these are psalms that appear to have been grouped together. They're called the enthronement psalms because they focus on the reign of Yahweh. And when you read through Psalm 99, there's some similarities to Psalm 98 and Psalm 96. And what's interesting about that is Psalm 98 and 96 sound a lot like when David brought the ark into the tabernacle. And I think it's 1 Chronicles 16. In fact, let's look there for a moment. Let me open up Psalm 96. If you go to that passage, Psalm 96. Sing to the Lord new songs, sing to the Lord all the earth, proclaim the good tidings, tell of his glory. Great is the Lord, greatly to be praised. Splendor and majesty are before him. Verse 10, say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Let the field exalt. Verse 12, so this idea of God being reigning, his greatness, his power, and we see similar statements in Psalm 98 as well. Sing to the Lord a new song. Shout joyfully to the Lord all the earth. Verse 7, let the sea roar and all it contains. Verse 9, before the Lord, for he's coming to judge the earth. There's a lot of similar language here. And what's very interesting is if we are a student of the Old Testament, these phrases should ring a bell. They should call them, oh, I remember seeing these somewhere else. 1 Chronicles 16. When they brought the ark of God and placed it inside the tent which David had pitched for us, so the tabernacle, David set up the tabernacle in Jerusalem, and they placed it there, the same tabernacle that had been taken through the desert with Moses. So here we are, 400 years later, approximately. They've got the same tent, and they set it up in Jerusalem, and then David brings the ark into the tent there in Jerusalem. Now, you remember that whole incident, right? When they first transported it, do you remember what happened? What did they put the ark on?
A cart.
The cart, right, with cattle. And is that how God prescribed the ark to be carried?
No.
Right? Not at all. Remember, he said that the priests were to carry it on poles. Well, they didn't do that. They put it on the cart. It's slipping off the cart, and
Somebody touched it.
Yeah.
Right.
Tell me his name again.
Uzzah.
Uzzah, thank you. Uzzah stops it from falling, and what happened to the guy?
Gets burned.
He got struck dead because he touched what God said should not be touched. It was sacred. And so then David, they don't bring it to Jerusalem at that point. They consult the law, which they should have done the first time, and then find out how they were supposed to carry it. So then they do that. They bring it in. This is 1 Chronicles 16. All right, verse 4. He appointed some of the Levites as ministers before the ark. And notice, by the way, verse 5. Who is the chief Levite who's ministering before the ark?
Asaph.
Asaph. Hey, we know this guy. And then verse 7. On that day, David first assigned Asaph and his relatives to give thanks to the Lord. This is when David appointed Asaph as the choir director, if you will, one of the choir directors for temple worship. And then David proclaims this psalm. And as you read through this psalm, we see many statements. I'm not going to read it all to you here, but he goes through some of the historical aspects. And then notice in verse 23, sing to the Lord all the earth, proclaim good tidings, tell of his glory, for great is the Lord, greatly to be praised. Verse 27, splendor and majesty are before him, strength and joy. And as you go through this psalm, there many of these same lines are found in Psalm 96 and Psalm 98.
Psalm 96.
Psalm 96 and Psalm 98. And notice, worship the Lord. Worship the Lord, verse 29. Tremble before him, all the earth. What psalm did we see that statement in? Psalm 99. Let all the earth tremble. Let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice, let them say among the nations, the Lord reigns. We're back to Psalm 98, verse 32 is the same phrase in Psalm 98, verse 33, we see in Psalm 96, Psalm 98. So as you go through this, I think Psalm 96 and Psalm 98 were from David, written during this same occasion.
Tim?
Yes.
Is it possible that that it also may have been Asaph who wrote this, since earlier David assigned him to give thanks to the Lord? So isn't it possible that he may have written this for the people of Israel's worship during this time?
Yeah, that was my first inclination when reading this, but when I studied the passage, here he just assigns Asaph to give thanks to the Lord, and I think verses 8 and following are this prescribed song that he gave Asaph to sing in thanks to the Lord. But I'm not going to die on that hill, but I think this particular 1 Chronicles 16 was a poem that David put together for Asaph to lead the people in giving thanks to the Lord. But you know, I can see why Asaph is a possibility as far as the one authoring this. But here I think verse 7 seems to indicate he just assigns Asaph a responsibility to give thanks, and then gives him the song basically to do that with. That's how I take it anyway. But on either case, we can see the connection between 1 Chronicles 16 and Psalm 96 and Psalm 98, and then also Psalm 99. So either David or possibly Asaph is the author of those, I believe. And here we have an indication possibly of the occasion for Psalm 99, 1 Chronicles 16. Any questions or thoughts, comments on that? How would we know to how could we know to make this connection? We're studying this on our own. We're not having anybody help us right now. No commentators or sermons or anything. How might we come about making this connection? What do you guys think?
Well, just looking at the similarity of the phrasing and the words that are used in Psalm 99 and there in 1 Chronicles 16 might be an indication.
Yeah, I think to me those make a pretty strong linkage there, and we see many examples of this in the Old Testament. For example, Psalm 18, I believe, has a direct. I think it was at 2 Samuel 22. It's almost the exact same psalm written in both places. So we have a few examples where we see elements of a psalm, part of it or much of it, written somewhere else in the Old Testament, in the historical books. I think it really reminds us of the importance of knowing our Bibles, right, and understanding the seeing the links. And also too, what you can do, guys, is if you're in, for example, Psalm 96, and you see the cross-reference here, sometimes your translations will help you out. You see this? First Chronicles 16 is mentioned here. So that's Psalm 40. But if you go through this psalm, you'll see, I think, a few references to First Chronicles 16. Yeah. Let me see if I haven't gone through all of these. Psalm 18. There's another reference to First Chronicles 16. Psalm 22. First Chronicles 16. So what? The first time I studied this group of psalms, as I went through, I looked at the footnotes or the cross references, and I noticed First Chronicles 16 showing up a lot. So that's when I looked over in First Chronicles 16. I read through it and I go, wow, there's a lot of similarities here. So sometimes you can be helped out by the translators if you're using a translation that has some of the cross references there. Somebody else has gone before us and can help us a little bit with that. Now in Psalm 99, I do not recall if there was, let's just look for a minute at the reference, Psalm 97. So we see the same. Psalm 97. Psalm 76. All right, so if we go through, okay. So only seen one reference to Psalm 97. In this one, but having read through First Chronicles 16, we see this phrase in First Chronicles 16. We see this phrase in First Chronicles 16. This phrase in First Chronicles 16. Let the earth shake. Okay, so we would notice several connections. So I think 99 is likely written by the same person who wrote 98, 97, and 96. And then 96 and 98 have their connection back to First Chronicles 16, where I believe David was the one who spoke in First Chronicles 16. So why does this matter? What is the importance here? Well, going back to our slide here, notice one of the things we are looking for is the occasion for the psalm. All right? And it really helps us if we can identify what is the background that prompted this psalm to be written. And here, if we could just skip ahead to the occasion, I think the occasion is strongly linked to the events of First Chronicles 16. All right? But clearly, within the psalm, as Pastor Robbie mentioned earlier, we see that, or I think it was Pastor Jan actually, sorry, where this focus in the psalm is on worship, on temple worship, and to exalt God at his temple. All right, and it would make sense if First Chronicles 16 is the historical occasion for this psalm, because that is exactly, this was the time when the ark is being brought to the temple. And so that statement in verse 1 about the Lord being above, enthroned above the cherubim would make a lot of sense wouldn't it? As they're carrying the ark up into the temple, they would see the cherubim on the top, they would see the mercy seat, and knowing historically that the Lord would reveal himself and his glory above that mercy seat over the cherubim, I think gives us a very likely picture of the occasion for this psalm, either being written right at that time when the temple was brought, or maybe immediately following that. Now, we can't be certain. We don't have a title that tells us explicitly this song was written when, but I think we can gather enough evidence from within the psalm to make a good case for it, that this was the likely occasion when this psalm was written. You guys following me? Does it make sense? Any questions or thoughts, comments, disagreement, arguments? Come on, let's go. All right. And I think I'm going through this because it's reinforcing our need, brothers, to really be familiar with our Bibles. And when you're studying the Psalms, especially being familiar with the time of David, you have to know the book of Samuel. You have to know the early part of Chronicles, because there are so many connections and links between that. It's just like with the epistles. What books should we really be familiar with outside of the epistles when we're studying the epistles?
Acts.
Book of Acts.
Book of Acts, right? It's the same thing. The books of Samuel and Chronicles, part of Kings, are important because they provide often much of the historical background for the Psalms. All right? So it's really key to see that connection. Now, sometimes, as Brother Harris mentioned earlier, Psalm 51 gave us the exact explicit circumstance. So we can go back to 2 Samuel 11 and 12 and read about that situation. Or Psalm 52 gave us the exact circumstance. We can go back to Samuel and read about Doeg the Edomite and what happened there. And I think here in Psalm 99, we are given the, based on our understanding of 1 Chronicles 16, I believe we're given a strong indication of the occasion for this particular psalm. The emphasis and focus is on worship and exaltation of the greatness of God, and likely during the time when his temple was being set up by David and the ark was being brought to it. Okay? Now, geography. Are there any places mentioned within the psalm? Sorry, I need to get a pen. Give me 1 second. Are there any places within the psalm?
Jerusalem, Zion.
Okay, so Zion
Holy
is
Hill.
mentioned. Holy Hill is mentioned. Any other locations mentioned here?
Footstool in verse
Yeah,
5.
the footstool that we talked about in verse 5. Now, as we consider these, Zion, what we'd want to do normally is identify, look up Zion, some cross references to it. But what is Zion? What place is that referring to?
Temple Mount.
Temple Mount.
Temple Mount, or the temple sometimes it's referenced to, or Jerusalem itself. It can be in reference to any of these. Now, in this passage, which one seems to be the most likely?
Jerusalem.
Could be Jerusalem, but remember that the psalm seems focused on one particular location in Jerusalem.
Temple.
Temple or Temple Mount.
Temple Mount. Okay.
And then Holy Hill, because we have Holy Hill mentioned later, that is a reference to what? What was the Holy Hill referring to?
Temple Mount.
Temple Mount.
Yeah. the Temple Mount. That's what's called the Holy Hill. If you look at other passages, if you look and cross-reference that term Holy Hill, that's what you'll see. And as I mentioned, footstool often it can refer to the earth. I think it's Isaiah 66, or the temple. And let me see if I wrote down. It doesn't look like I wrote it down here. I know it's in Chronicles. I can't remember the specific passage. I'll have to look up. But I think it's 1 Chronicles 26 or something like that. Okay, and given this psalm, I think he's speaking here, the references to the temple. All right, we'll see that more as we go forward. So these are the locations mentioned. All right, we have the reference. Yeah, go ahead.
It's 1 Chronicles 28.
28. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Verse 2.
What does it say?
Verse 2, then King David rose to his feet and said, listen to me, my brethren, my people. I had intended to build a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God.
There we go.
So I made preparations to build it.
Yeah. All right, so the footstool reference there. Okay, now, any people mentioned in this poem?
Moses, Aaron, verse 6, and also Samuel.
And are these men obscure? Do we not know much about them? Right, these are what we would go ahead.
They're key people.
Yeah, we would call these guys the big guns.
Yeah,
they're the Moses, of course, right? He is the prophet of Israel until Jesus comes, right? He's the preeminent prophet. Aaron, his brother, the first high priest. Then Samuel was a prophet, right, who was given a special and unique place as well, in that he was the first prophet in many, many generations to speak for the Lord, and the prophet who then anointed King David. All right, so these are three prominent individuals that are mentioned here. All right. And what we might want to do is, you can include a little more information about them. Again, the idea is not just to identify the names, but talk about what do we know about them. So Moses, right, was the key leader, prominent prophet. Aaron was the first high priest of Israel. Samuel, again, was a judge, prophet, and the Lord spoke through him. Again, first time in many generations. If you go back to the book of Samuel, it said the word of the Lord was infrequent in those days, and then Samuel was raised up by the Lord. Okay? So we won't discuss well, what are they doing here? How are they connected? That will come later, but at least we want to identify who the people are mentioned in this psalm. This is just like we were doing for epistles, right? We're getting the same kind of information. Author, recipients, geographical context, the occasion for writing, particular people mentioned, when was the psalm likely written, okay? These are the same kinds of things we were looking for the epistles, because again, we're just looking for the background setting of this particular poem, okay?
Mm.
And this is going to mean, a lot of reading through this a number of times to get familiar with the poem and to start seeing these things. And then, like I said, feel free to use a cross-reference and look up some cross-references there from the poem. That'll help give you some other clues, all right? What I'm discouraging you to do right now is getting outside other resources, but you're welcome to use a cross-reference, look up other passages, because it's important. The self-discovery is so important. That's how we will remember things, and that's, I think, a way for us to encourage us to be diligent in digging into the scripture. But I do understand if you want to go to like Zondervan Encyclopedia is a good resource to get some of this information. course, the MacArthur Study Bible will have some of this information. There's a few resources like that, but I would encourage you, just try to get a on your own, do some digging, use a cross-reference. The Treasury of Scripture Knowledge is a really helpful book where you get a lot of cross-references that you can look up. Okay? All right. Okay, so that is the background context, where we're identifying the setting of the psalm, its background. The next step is then to identify what kind of psalm is it? What type of poem are we looking at? And by that I mean, and in class, if you go through pages 25 to 27 of the syllabus that I sent you guys, the teacher's manual, you can go through and it'll have detailed explanation, but these are the different psalm types that I mentioned there, okay? And we won't go through all the details here. I think you're all familiar with these. Praise psalms, lament, imprecatory. It's a particular type of lament that focuses on cursing one's enemies. The songs of ascent, wisdom psalms, which are instructional, enthronement psalms. This is where the focus is on Yahweh as king. Royal psalms. These are psalms that are usually focused on a human king, sometimes the Lord, but some event or occasion that happened in the life of one of the kings. Songs of Zion, these are psalms that are focused specifically on the temple, on Jerusalem. And then the Hallel psalms, those are ones that were sung during the festivals, particularly Passover, Psalms 113 to 118. All right? And I think this grouping of the psalms here, these types, covers most of, if you go to some books, they'll have like 20 or 30 different types of psalms. I think that's a little bit too detailed. I think this group of three, about 9 different types of psalms, will really cover most every psalm that you're going to encounter. Now, as we think about these different types, which one do you think Psalm 99 would fall under? Is this a psalm of lament?
No.
No. Is it a song of ascent? No, those are Psalms 120 to 134, and all of those have a title which indicate that they are a song of ascent. Is it a wisdom psalm? Is it written to give instruction like a proverb? I don't think so. It gives instruction, it gives a command, but it's not in that sense. Enthronement psalm, again, these psalms are focusing on Yahweh reigning as sovereign Lord. Would Psalm 99 fit that?
Yes.
I think so. In fact, the enthronement psalms often will have some sort of statement, Yahweh reigns, or Yahweh is exalted. And as we look at Psalm 99, that's definitely the focus there. And so I think we can see this psalm as an enthronement psalm. And as we look at the psalm itself, for example, notice how it begins. Verse 1.
The Lord reigns.
And then it says, verse 1, he is enthroned. Right? And then verse 2, he is exalted. Verse 5, exalt. Verse 9. So these have all the elements of that. Yeah, is there a comment or question?
Tim, is it possible that this is also a royal psalm because of verse 4?
Verse 4, the strength of the king.
Yeah.
Yeah, the royal psalms, as that category has been defined, usually refers to it's a psalm written on a particular occasion or event of a usually human king. sometimes it can be in reference to the Messiah. So usually it's like Psalm 49, I think, speaking of King Solomon's wedding. So it's usually royal psalms have more that idea of us focusing on a human king on some particular occasion, whereas an enthronement psalm is exclusively focused on Yahweh as the sovereign king over the universe. So there's a slight distinction there, but some people combine that category and they'd call this a royal psalm. I wouldn't argue with them because, you know, Yahweh is king. So, and there's a reference to king in verse 4. But enthronement has the idea of it's even more focused on Yahweh as the great king who is exalted over all. And that the focus of the psalm is calling attention to that. The royal psalms are more like describing some event in a particular king's life. Does that make sense, the distinction?
Yeah. Yep.
But some people combine those two categories, and they would call this a royal psalm. I'm not going to argue with that, but I like the enthronement psalm category because it is a particular focus. And the enthronement psalms, I think, are 93 to 99 are among those. So they're grouped together. There's a few other ones as well. Okay? So this psalm is focused on that. Other examples would be Psalm 93 to 99, Psalm 96, or 67, I mean. It's also another example. Okay? Now, so that's simply, this step is only just identifying what type of psalm it is, so we understand its category. The third part of this second step, after identifying the background context, the type of the psalm, is now to try to identify the structure of the poem, and by that I mean its outline. Can we identify the stanzas within the poem? And who can tell me again, what is a stanza? Just so we're clear.
It's the way the poetry is broken up into clusters.
Okay, good. The way the poem is broken up into clusters. All right.
It's the paragraph version in poetry.
Yeah, the paragraph version in poetry. And by that meaning that the stanza, a stanza contains a particular thought, like in a paragraph. There's a particular thought, or maybe we could even say, or theme, that is the focus of that stanza. It's just like in our songs today. We'll have a stanza, which usually it's several verses that are surrounding a particular theme. Then we'll have a chorus, usually, and then we'll sing another stanza, which gives attention to another particular topic or thought, and then sing a chorus. And that's usually how, like you think of Amazing Grace, it's the whole song is focused on God's amazing grace, but each stanza covers a specific aspect of his grace. And actually, as you go through the song, it covers aspects from the past, present, and the future. God's grace, how it's evident in each of those situations. But each stanza has its own thought, unit of thought, like a paragraph in an epistle. Okay? And so what we're doing basically is, if you remember in the epistles, when we were looking at identifying each paragraph, that's essentially what we're doing here, identifying each stanza, so that we can then track the author's unit of thought through the poem. Okay? Most poems contain more than one stanza. There are some psalms that are just one stanza. I mean, you think of Psalm 117, it's just 2 verses. So it's essentially one stanza. But you have Psalm 119. Who can tell me how many stanzas are in that psalm? How many letters are in the Hebrew alphabet? Any Hebrew scholars among us?
Was it 20 or 23?
You're close. Yeah, 22.
22. Okay.
22 stanzas, because each stanza of 8 verses
begins with the Hebrew alphabet.
Begins with the a letter from the Hebrew alphabet. So we have verses 1 to 8 begin with Aleph, verses 9 to 16 begin with Beth, all the way through. So there are 22 stanzas there. All right. Now, in this particular psalm, Psalm 99, as we look at it, but before we do that, let me just discuss, so how do we do this? How do we identify the outline of the psalm? You know, the psalmist doesn't tell us, you know, stanza 1, stanza 2, stanza 3. So how do we figure this out? You guys have any thoughts?
There are usually breaks that are clear, gaps between certain groups of verses.
But how do we notice, how do we identify those breaks or gaps? How do we know we have a gap or a break?
There's a space.
Okay,
In
well,
other some there are words like set, those musical pauses.
oh, Salah? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. In
Okay.
other psalms, but not here.
Yeah, not in Psalm 99, but other psalms. Yeah, well, one way, you know, and I was laughing, Pastor Robbie, but actually, it's compare the translations. You know, the spaces that we see are actually the translators put those spaces in, because the translators actually make an attempt to identify stanzas. Just like the translators make an attempt to identify the paragraphs. Remember we went through that a long time ago. The New American Standard has a bolds the number for each paragraph. The NIV indents, the ESV also indents each new paragraph. And we notice here in, let me take us back to the Psalm here, and I'll show you. You can see this in your Bibles, but if we go to Psalm 99 here, which is where we're at, notice in the New American Standard translation how you see verse 1, can you tell that it's bolded? I don't know if that's obvious. It's bold, in bold font. And then verse 4, that doesn't show up real well on this one. And then verse 6. But if you go to the ESV, what the ESV uses is spaces. See that? Between verse 5 and verse 6, there's a space. Between verse 7 and verse 8. If we go over to the New International Version, same thing. Notice there's a space here between verse 3 and 4, and a space between verse 5 and 6. And so one thing we can do, and this is what I will often do, is the first thing that I'll attempt is to look at what do the translations do? Compare the translations and how they are spaced. All right? And we'll do that in a minute for Psalm 99. The second thing is to look for structural markers. And this is what Athan was talking about. One example, he mentioned Salah, but there are also refrains, inclusio is also sometimes a structural marker that you can use. All right, these might be things within the psalm. If you see a particular repeat of a statement or a verse, that could be a structural marker indicating the beginning or ending of a stanza. All right, and then finally, look for other changes. Change in speaker or grammar or tone or subject matter or exclamations like behold or whoa or something like that. So sometimes there's other kinds of changes that you can use to identify a change in the stanza. Okay, so let's apply this process to Psalm 99. All right, let's try to identify the stanzas in the psalm. So the first thing we're going to do is compare the translations. All right, and so again, what I did is I've got here these translations. The New American Standard, I just copied and pasted. They have a, yeah, this is right. So New American Standard, if you notice, has 2 stanzas, verses 1 through 4. Because notice verse 1 is, I'll try to expand it a little bit. Verse 1 is boldface and verse 5 is boldface. So the New American Standard sees 2 stanzas here. All right? Let's look at the ESV. The ESV has 1, 2, 3 stanzas.
3.
Okay? That's how again, these are from the translators. There's nothing in the original text, the Hebrew text, that indicates a stanza change, except possibly Salah. All right? But that's only sometimes. All right? So these are the interpretation of the translator. That's why we're going to see some differences here. Let's look at the New King James Version. New King James has verses 1 to 3, 4 to 5, and then actually, the space shouldn't be there, 6 through 9. Okay? Finally, the NIV, 1 through 3, 4 through 5, 6 through 7, 8 through 9. So if we take all these together, these are how that breaks out. Now, do the translators agree on the stanzas? No.
No.
In fact, they don't, none of them agree with each other. It's kind of like sometimes when a bunch of theologians get in a room, you know, they just can't seem to agree, all right? So notice here, so that doesn't help us. Now, if we had had 2 or 3 of these translations that agreed, that would give us a good indication of you know, if we get agreement among a few translations, then that would be a good place to start. But unfortunately, we don't get agreement not only in the number of stanzas, but also then too in where the stanzas are located. All right, so unfortunately in this case, comparing the translations didn't help us a whole lot. Sometimes it will. It's just like when we did paragraph analysis. Sometimes the translations would break up the paragraphs in an epistle very similarly, but sometimes they didn't. And the reason is because it's interpretive. All right? There's nothing in the original text that tells us specifically where these stanzas are. Just like there's nothing in the original text that tells us in the epistles where to break up the paragraphs. That's going to be an interpretive decision. But as I said, sometimes comparing the translations, we will see very similar ones, and so that can be helpful. All right, so we're going to have to go to our next step, and that is looking for structural markers. All right, looking for structural markers. And again, do we see any Salah here or any refrain? That is like a repeated chorus. Inclusio.
Holy is he.
Okay, who said that?
I said that, Pastor Tim. Harris.
Oh, I can't find. Oh, there you are, Brother Harris. Yeah, did you notice there is a repetition of holy is he? Where?
Verse 3 and verse 5.
Verse 3, verse 5, and then notice
And verse 9.
Verse 9 says holy is Yahweh our God. So it's very, very close. All right, so, okay, this is helpful. If we look at the psalm, we see this repetition of this particular statement. Holy is he, holy is he, holy is he. So that might indicate the ending of each of those stanzas. Okay, that this is a place to start. So this structural marker indicates possibly we have the following.
Yeah, even verses 5 and 9.
Yes, and notice verses
Like
5 and 9. What's that, Pastor Robbie?
Sounds like they're a refrain or.
They're almost exactly the same statement. There's just a few small variations, isn't there?
Yeah, they sound like they're a refrain of sorts.
Yes. So here we see again that would indicate you know, at least the stanza, one stanza ending at verse 5, and then another stanza ending at verse 9, and then by reference to holy is he, you know, which there again is what we noticed at first. There appears to be a, you know, that stanza ending at verse 3 as well. Okay, so structure markers seem to point to 2 or 3 stanzas.
Yeah.
All right. Now, there's also, if we keep going, let's look for, are there any other changes that as we go through the psalm, we can notice? Let's take us back to the psalm here. I don't know if we can see all this at one time. Hopefully you guys can. So far, we have this as a proposal based on the structural markers, okay? Because we have the last word, holy is he. Try to highlight that. I'm sorry, guys. I hope, can you all see this?
Yeah.
All right. So that's one indicator. A second one is, as Pastor Robbie noticed, we have exalt the Lord, worship at his footstool. And then verse 9, exalt the Lord, worship at his holy hill. Yep. Okay. Now we don't have that same thing in verse 3, but we do have something else. There is another pattern here in these 3 stanzas that I think supports that there are 3 stanzas. Do you guys see it?
Yep.
What do you see?
There's a command to do something, to praise, to exalt God.
Yes. And then notice verses 1 and 2. The Lord reigns.
Mm-hmm.
Let me try to pick another color here. The Lord reigns. Let me highlight this in gray.
Yeah,
he is enthroned. The Lord is great. So there's these statements, okay? And then a command. Notice here, strength of the king loves justice. Statement. You have established equity. Statement. You have executed justice. Statement. And then a command. Exalt the Lord our God. Verse 6. He answered them. Statement. He spoke to them. Statement. Testimonies he gave them. You answered them. Statement. You were a forgiving God to them. Statement. You were an avenger. Statement. Then a command. Do you guys see this? It's a grammatical pattern.
Mm-hmm.
There's, in the beginning of the stanza, the indicative. Statements made about the Lord. The ending line of the stanza is a command in response to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same pattern, broken up by this command followed by the refrain, holy is he. You guys see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Any questions or comments or any disagreements? Fine too, if you see something else. I think this psalm, to me, has a clear indication that it's 3 stanzas based on the refrain, based on this pattern of indicative, then imperative in each stanza, and then based on the command being similar, the same in verses 5 to 9, and then similar at the end in verse 3.
Yeah.
Statement about God, response or command, and then holy is he. Statement about God, verse 4, response, command in verse 5, ending in holy is he. Statements about God in verses 6 through 8, response, in verse 9, and then the end, holy is Yahweh our God. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Mm.
And then, yes.
I think this portion of our exercises is a great reminder to us when we're looking at the Psalms or poetry, that the version breaks or stanzas are just a starting point. And looking at the structural of the psalm, no, is even more helpful in terms of the way we break this right?
Yeah. Yeah, the translations, you know, I found sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. Like in the Psalm 99, they're not. Except if we do notice, the New King James actually gets a point here. The New King James actually does identify those 3 stanzas. They're the only one that did. All right. The NIV does identify the first 2 stanzas, but then for some reason splits up the 3rd one. Okay. But yeah, the New American Standard, I think, really blew this one. You know.
Yeah.
But again, it's interpretive, so it's okay. Sometimes you're going to find they're very helpful, and other times they're not. So that's why I have you do these 3 steps. 1, look at the translation, see what they tell you. If there's agreement, then that's a good sign that that's likely, you know, where the stanzas are. But then look, do your own study. Look for structural markers. And in this case, the structural marker we see is the refrain. And then look for any other changes. Again, those other changes can be, as I mentioned, in the form of grammar and things like that. So here, the other changes are, 1, we have a grammatical pattern. Indicative followed by imperative. Meaning the first part of the stanza makes statements about God, and then the stanza ends with the expected response or command followed by the refrain, holy is he. Okay? So there's a grammatical pattern here, but there's also a pattern in regards to the subject or theme. Let's go back. As we look at each of these stanzas that we've identified, notice something here. Let me just point out to you, let's use this color. Okay, what idea do we see repeated in this first stanza, verses 1 to 3? By those repeated words. Brother Manny, what do you think? You still with us? How about DJ? You there, DJ?
Yes, Pastor Tim. It talks about the sovereignty of God.
Yeah. That's the focus, right? His greatness, his exaltedness. As we look at the second stanza, what words do we see repeated here? Pastor Entz, what do you see repeated in the second stanza?
Justice.
Justice, righteousness.
Justice, equity.
Equity. You see that?
Yeah.
Synonyms for a similar idea. And then as we look at the last stanza, we have this idea of God answered.
God spoke. God's relationship.
Answered. Forgiving.
Avenger.
Yeah, do you see that? There are 3 distinct themes, focuses here. The first stanza is focusing on his greatness. The second stanza on his justice. The third one on his
dealing. He's dealing with Israel.
Dealing with Israel, maybe his mercy, something like that. Grace. So I think even at this point, we can see a distinct difference in the theme or focus of these and they follow the stanzas. So the focus in this one is on, let's just say, God's greatness. In verses 4 and 5, the focus is on God's mercy, or justice. In verses 6 to 9, the focus is on God's mercy or grace, dealings with Israel, something like that. Okay? So I think in the case of this psalm, to me, it's pretty clear that we've got 3 stanzas here based on multiple aspects. All right. Now, sometimes the Psalms is not so clear. Psalm 51 is one that I have trouble finding a distinct pattern in stanzas. I think it's just one long stanza, really, where he's pouring out his heart. But some people do see a little structure there in that poem. But many poems we can find the structure of it. I think this poem, it to me is pretty clear. That refrain, "Holy is He," is a strong indicator. And then as well, this grammatical pattern of the indicative and then the imperative in each stanza, ending with an imperative, and then the subject or theme, I think, is clearly different in each of those 3 stanzas. Okay? You follow me? Are we clear on that? Is that helpful? You can see that? So these are the kinds of things you're going to want to look for as you're examining the structure of the poem. Again, we want to be able to identify stanzas early on because we're wanting to identify the author's unit of thought. And here he has 3 units of thought. They're all centered around this idea of holy is He, because he repeats that each time. But there seems to be a different aspect of God that he draws our attention to in each of those 3 stanzas. Okay? And this is why you won't see these kinds of things as obvious if you're not reading through the psalm many, many times to get familiar with it. And in fact, my encouragement to you, if you're going to preach from a psalm, is to work at memorizing the psalm. Unless it's Psalm 119. But you can memorize that too, but that will take a little longer. Usually the psalms that I'm preaching from, I try to memorize them in the course of the week as I'm studying it, because then as you do that, things stick out to you. You get more familiar with it, and you do begin to see patterns. And the Spirit, as you're meditating on it, He really helps to bring things to mind. Okay? And this is a good example of just making good observations, being very familiar with the psalm. You'll begin to see patterns in it that stick out, that will help you see its structure. Any questions? All right, let's just take a few minutes and introduce parallelism. We'll start there, and then next week we'll pick up on looking at some examples of it. I just want to do a quick review of parallelism. It's a critical, key element in Hebrew poetry, as we talked about last week. Let me put. Let's see, who am I going to? Athan, let me ask you this. Do you remember the 3 elements of Hebrew poetry that we talked about last week? The 3 key elements, characteristics.
Yes. The terseness. The other one is parallelism. And
you can cheat and look on the notes if you want.
The imagery.
Imagery, there you go.
Yeah, the imagery. Thank you.
2 out of 3, that was good. Okay, terseness, that is just the brevity, the shortness. Parallelism, that's very common in Hebrew poetry, very common in the Psalms and in Proverbs, but it's not used all the time. But if you're studying a psalm, it's likely you're going to see parallelism in almost every verse. And then imagery is a 3rd element, and that's where we deal with figurative language and things like that. So what I want us to do now is we're going to move to the 3rd step in our poetic analysis, after doing reading observations, after identifying the setting and the structure, we want to then examine the parallelism that's used in each verse, because that is beginning now to tell us how the author is communicating these particular themes, and it'll give us an idea of the meaning and the intent that he's trying to communicate in these verses. So before we get to Psalm 99, we'll probably do that next week, let me just begin with the question of what is, when we say parallelism, what do we mean? What are we talking about? Pastor Rene, when we say parallelism, what are we describing or speaking of here? The rooster has something to say.
Two ideas. It's like two ideas, similar ideas expressed.
How? In what way?
In two ideas in two sentences.
Okay.
Expressions.
Within the verse.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So yeah, each verse in the poem will have 2 or 3, sometimes 4 lines that are related to each other. And here's the key: intentionally. I can't intentionally. Okay, and what I mean by that is within each verse, the author in Hebrew poetry, one of the elements that's used is matching or connecting each line within the verse. So there's an intentional connection or relationship between those 2 lines within each verse. It's like in Western poetry, rhyming is very typical in Western poetry. That's a typical element. Well, in Hebrew poetry, a very common element is this parallelism, where one line is written in a verse and then the next line is somehow related to it. Either it says the same thing, it says the opposite thing, or something else. It describes, we could say, parallelism describes the relationship or connection between lines within a verse of Hebrew poetry. Okay, the key words here are relationship, connection. Okay, this is really important to remember. All right, and again, especially when we're looking at the Psalms. All right, so let's ask ourselves, what kind of parallelism do we see in Hebrew poetry? What's the most common? Comes to your mind? How are the 2 lines most often related to each other?
Developmental.
Synonymous. Okay. Synonymous parallelism. That is the second line repeats the idea of the first. All right. So pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before stumbling. Do you notice the similarity? We have pride, haughty spirit. Those are synonymous. Goes before. Oh, I should do another color. And then destruction. Stumbling. See that? Perfectly synonymous. That's how they're connected together. All right, that's probably the most common. The second most common, I heard this mentioned a moment ago, is
developmental.
Okay, that's the third one. We'll get to that one. Before developmental, contrastive. Now, some people, the really smart people, like to use this word, antithetical. But that's too many syllables for me. I like contrastive, all right? That makes more sense. Contrast, all right? We see that clearly here. Not only in the word but, of course, but we have house of the wicked, tent of the upright. Those are two opposites, correct? Wicked, the upright. And in it says the wicked, house of the wicked will be destroyed, okay? Will be and then destroyed. But the house of the righteous will flourish. Again, opposites. Destroyed, flourish. So this is contrastive, all right? Now, we don't always have a but. Notice in this one, the wages of the righteous and the income of the wicked. All right, those are contrastive, right? Righteous, wicked. And then it says, is life, the wages of the righteous is life, but the wages of the wicked, the income of the wicked is punishment. But notice there's no but at the beginning of this verse. So don't always look for a but or an and. Sometimes the word and will be there, and it's it's still contrastive. All right?
The idea.
So you will often see the word but you will not always see the word but. All right? So keep that in mind. All right, now, somebody, I think, who told me, what's the third one?
Developmental.
Developmental. Now this one is where we would say the second line, let me see here, or one line develops the other line in some way. And there are three ways that we see developmental parallelism. One is that it expands, expansion or addition. Okay, notice in this Proverbs 14, the heart knows its own bitterness, and that's a helpful clue, a stranger does not share its joy. The second line here is adding more information to the first. Okay, we don't see synonymous parallelism here. He doesn't say the heart knows its own bitterness, and then if he had said the soul understands its pain, that would be synonymous parallelism. But he doesn't do that here. He adds more information, so it's an expansion or an addition to the first line. Another type of developmental is explanation or illustration, where the one line explains or illustrates the other. So here, the refining pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests hearts. So here, the statement is the Lord tests hearts. Now, an illustration of that is the refining pot. Okay, now in this case, the first line illustrates the second. So this tells us as well that in parallelism, sometimes the second line, the first line develops the second, or vice versa, meaning the opposite. So when you're looking at parallelism and developmental, sometimes it's the second line, that's the statement, and the first line is what develops it. Or in this case, it illustrates it. You guys see that? So the statement here in this verse, this is the theological statement. The Lord tests the hearts. Well, what's an illustration of that? The refining pot, silver in the refining pot, or furnace, gold in the furnace. Okay, that's an illustration of, in the same way, the Lord tests the hearts. Tests hearts. Okay? All right, and then finally, a third type of developmental parallelism is a reason or a result. That is, the second line, or one line, gives the reason or result of the other. So here, notice here's the statement, leave the presence of a fool. And then look at the second line. That's a result. If you don't leave the presence of the fool, this is what will happen. See that? He's not illustrating. He's not expanding. He's actually saying, this is going to be the result. Or this is the reason you should leave the presence of a fool. All right? Okay, so those are the three common ones. We have expansion, explanation, reason. All right, so as you're looking at parallelism, if it doesn't look like it's synonymous or contrastive, then it's likely developmental, and it'll be the one line will be developing the other in one of these three ways. Okay? Now, there are a couple of others. I think when we were in class, we called one sort of the formal or miscellaneous. All right, that was basically unknown. And in Cebu, we called it this category ambut. Okay? What's the Tagalog expression for that? Like, I don't know.
Ewan.
Ewan.
How do you spell that? Ewan?
E-W-A-N. E-W-A-N.
Ewan. That's like,
yeah.
I have no idea.
Don't know.
Don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll call it Ewan. Ewan, Ewan. How do you pronounce
Ewan.
it? Ewan.
Ewan.
Ewan. I think of Ewan McGregor. Anyway, Obi-Wan. Okay, Ewan. We'll call it maybe Obi-Wan. How's that? That's going to be our special name for it. Okay? So Obi-Wan means I don't know. Okay. Now, this one's rare. I mean, basically, it's not really a formal category. It just you know, I can't really see the connection here. So that might mean one of two things. One is there is parallelism, but it's not clear what it is. Or two, there isn't parallelism being used. All right. And this isn't just in the Psalms. You're just going to see probably just, you know, a few % of the cases like this. Usually it will be one of the first three, either synonymous, contrastive, or developmental. Now, there's a specialized category called chiasm. Usually, it's used with synonymous parallelism, but it's a special kind. All right, if you'll remember, it is, let's move this over so you can see this. All right. All right, chiasm is where the second line is in reverse grammatically compared to the first. All right, so for example, here we have, be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. But then the second line, notice it begins with according to. He says, according to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. So this reflects actually in the Hebrew where the second line, the author reverses the order. He puts according to at the beginning of the second line and puts the statement at the end of the second line. All right? So it's like a mirror. You could think of chiasm like a mirror image. Right? When you look in a mirror, you see the reverse of what like what you're wearing. Like my shirt here, it's a mirror image actually on the screen. It's flipped it around, it's showing me in reverse. That's what a chiasm is like. The last line is a reverse mirror image of the first line. And they do that, the author does this intentionally because he's focusing attention on the middle, the line that was reversed. So it's a way to emphasize. Okay, in verse 1 of Psalm 51, David is emphasizing God's loving kindness and compassion in this prayer that he's making. Okay? Okay, so those are the types of parallelism. Next week, Lord willing, when we gather, we'll look at some examples of these, and then we'll go through Psalm 99. What I would ask you men to do during the week is just identify on your own the parallelism in Psalm 99. Okay? See if you can do that. All right? And how we do that is there's 2 steps to that. To identify the parallelism, you first need to determine the number of lines within the verse, and then determine parallelism between each line. Okay? How you determine the number of lines will be given by the translation. So just make an attempt at it, and we'll look through it together next week. But the more you're able to try it on your own, I think the more you will get out of our discussion next week. All right? It's not required homework. You're not going to be graded, but I think if you can take 30 minutes at some point during a week and go through those 9 verses, see if you can identify the parallelism, I think that will really enhance our discussion next week. Okay? All right. Any thoughts or questions, comments, questions related to what we covered, or it's related to something else?
Will you be sending this note to Pastor Tim?
Well, I'll be sending what?
Will you be sending these notes?
Yes.
Today's discussion?
Yeah. I sent last week's out.
Yeah.
So yeah, my plan is to do that, and I'm having trouble uploading the videos for the sessions, but I'll take another attempt at it this week to do that, so you can have the recording as well if you want it.
All right.
Or Tim, is it possible to just put the videos on Dropbox and just give us a link to Dropbox?
Okay, I'll try to do that. I'll do that, or I'll put it on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. I get like five views a month on that, so it's a very popular channel. I'm getting lots of money from it, so. But so yeah, I'll put it on YouTube so you can view it, so I can keep getting more money from all the views. But I'll try to figure a way to get these. I'll either put it in Dropbox or YouTube or something like that. All right, but definitely by tomorrow I should be able to get the handout, the notes to you, in a written form. Okay. All right. Dr. Quinn, would you close us in prayer, unless there's any final questions or comments? All right. Dr. Quinn, would you?
Let us pray. Father, we honor you and we bless your name.